Okay, so now we're going to be looking at page 15 and page 16 in the introducing book, the red book. This introduces, as it says on the top of page 15, quavers on the bass drum. So far we've been doing quavers on our hi-hats, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and, but now we're going to be introducing quavers on the bass drum, so they're a bit quicker. Now I'm going to say all of the exercises before I play them, and I want you to practice saying them so that when you start playing them you can say them while you're playing them. Okay, so exercise 1, the main groove is bass and snare and bass, bass, snare and bass and snare and bass, bass, snare and bass and snare and bass, bass, snare and bass. Finishes on a bass, and then you've got a crotchet rest and a minute rest afterwards. Let's try and play it. You ready? Exercise 2, the groove is bass, bass, snare and bass and snare and bass, bass, snare and bass and snare and bass, bass, snare and bass and snare and bass, bass, snare and bass, then a rest. It's played mezzo piano, this one. The last one was mezzo forte, so half loud, which means I was just playing it kind of down the middle. This one is mezzo piano, which means half quiet. Okay, so a bit softer than before. Here we go. 2, 3, 4. Exercise 3, you've now got 2 double bass drums going on. It's back to mezzo forte, so you can play it a bit louder again. Let's say it together first though. It's going to go bass, bass, snare and bass, bass, snare and bass, bass, snare and bass, bass, snare and like that, okay? And then you can see it's got a fill at the end, which is 3 T's on the snare. T, T, T. Here we go. I'm going to play the whole thing. Exercise 3. 2, 3, 4. Now the next exercise on page 15, exercise 4, is a bit more tricky because it's missing a bass drum. If you look at the bottom you can see there's some rest. There's a crotchet rest and a minute rest, which means that you don't play a bass drum where you'd expect to play a bass drum, okay? So we say this one like this: bass, bass, snare and tut, tut, snare and bass, bass, snare and tut, tut, snare and bass, bass, snare and tut, tut, snare and bass, bass, snare and bass. The tut, tut, if you haven't guessed what it is already, it's this. Tut, tut. Okay? So I'm going to play it, but again, practice saying it whilst you play it. This is probably the most challenging one. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, now we're going to go on to page 16, which is a little bit more tricky again. Be very careful with this one. The bass drum on exercise 5 comes straight after the snare. There's no and between it, okay? So, if we say it, it's bass and snare, bass, and then a minim rest, 2-beat rest. So it goes bass and snare, bass, bass and snare, bass, bass and snare, bass, bass and snare, bass. Let's try and play it. Remember to say it for a while first though. Here we go. 3, 4. Exercise 6 moves on from this, and in those rests you've suddenly got some different elements coming in, okay? So it goes bass and snare, bass, and then a bass. And then on the second bar, if you look at the second bar, it goes bass and snare, bass, bass, and then a snare. okay? And this alternates, which means it goes back and forth between one bar and the other, okay? So the first bar, try say it, bass and snare, bass, bass, rest, bass and snare, bass, bass, rest. Second bar, bass and snare, bass, bass, snare, bass and snare, bass, bass, snare. But remember it switches between the two, so I'm going to play it now. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Bass and snare, bass, bass, rest. Bass and snare, bass, bass, snare. That one's a bit tricky, that one. You might want to practice each bar 4 or 8 times in a row before you put the whole thing together. And then the final one, which is very important because it's going to be used in the next piece, is the full groove. So exercise 7, it goes like this. Bass and snare, bass, bass and snare, and bass and snare, bass, bass and snare, and bass and snare, bass, bass and snare, and bass and snare, bass, bass and snare. And let's try and play it together. Remember to say it first and say it while you play when you first try playing it. Always say while you play when you're trying to play it, okay? 2, 3, together.